Good. I think we're ready to start. All right, ready? Welcome back, everyone. I'm here to introduce our panel right after lunch, so I hope everyone's gotten your sustenance and is ready to go. Thinking about this panel when I was first asked to present the speakers, I was thinking liquid landscape. Can a landscape be liquid? So that's something that I'm going to think about more as we listen to the three papers we have today. Three very different papers that cover very different topics, but all with the element of water. I am a curator, so I'm not an academic, and when I think about paintings, drawings, objects, I think about their materiality a lot. And as I've noticed during the course of the panels this morning, we're thinking about landscape in terms of its materiality a lot in this conference. So it's very interesting to think about landscape as earth, but now we'll be thinking about water. So the papers here are going to navigate, if you'll forgive the term, a balance between floods and rivers, the sea, and islands. So thinking about them as ways to construct as spaces that construct history, identity, even economy. So I will first introduce our first speaker, who's standing here next to me. Stephen Daniels is a professor emeritus of cultural geography at the University of Nottingham. He is author and co-author of a number of books, and of which I'll mention only a few, including The Iconography of Landscape, Mapping the Landscape, Humphrey Repton, Landscape Gardening and the Geography of Georgian England, and Paul Sandby, Picturing Britain. And in 2015, The Landscape of the National Trust. He is currently completing a book on the 19th century topographer John Britton. Today, Professor Daniels will be speaking on changing cultural views concerning hydrographies, which is a new word to me, or in other words, the liquid landscape. Please welcome Stephen Daniels.
Thank you very much. It was a new word to me. It was a misprint in the text. Liquid landscape. Water in its various forms, from rivers to clouds and in amphibious sites from marshes to meadows, has long been an integral, perhaps characteristic part of the landscape arts in Britain. Currently, water is emerging as a key element in a wider global environmental imagination, particularly the extremities of its distribution, from floods to drought, connected with large-scale narratives of climate change and human development. You might say, looking at the literature, that water levels have been rising in academic scholarship. Everywhere you look, there are studies of various forms in wide-ranging environment societies across the spectrum of the arts and humanities and sciences. A range of topics from modernity to citizenship, once largely inland matters, are now on the waterfront, materially and imaginatively. And I'm thinking of books like Matthew Gandy's The Fabric of Space, Water, Modernity, and the Urban Imagination, or Liquid Power, Hydromodernities in Spain by Eric Swinnegow. So liquidity has become a key word. Liquid times, liquid history, liquid cities, and sometimes with a wider implication of flow and circulation and echoes of capital liquidity. Landscape itself appears more liquid as a field of inquiry, with the traditional lexicon of rivers, coasts, lakes, and marshes overspilling into a more liminal zone of waterlands and waterscapes. And as we heard this morning from Anna's fascinating talk on estuary landscapes, peninsulas, creeks, spits, and sandbanks, a littoral zone, L-O-T-T-O-R. So I think it's timely to consider this water environment within a longer and wider terra aqueous historical geographical perspective on wider ecologies, to consider relations of land and water, liquidity and solidity, and landscape as a lens for these environmental developments. And this paper considers the cultural hydrographies of past and present, water management as well as supply. And the first part considers the place of water in the work of contemporary photographer Jem Southam, and the second part considers the hydrographies of John Constable's landscapes in critical views of his work as well as in the work itself. And this paper has a significant contribution by my Nottingham colleague, Nick Alfrey. Jem Southam is known for the books of his work as well as his gallery exhibits in a series of volumes characterized by texts as well as photographs, authored by Southam himself, as well as other writers in essays and narratives of various kinds, all contribute to the eloquence of the work. So this picture, the River X 2010, was a precursor to his book called The River in Winter, which had an essay by Richard Hamlin, which started out with the arresting phrase, "Winter is the driest season." And it was about the issue of dryness and thawing, about the idea of growing the beginnings of liquid life at the end of winter. If people are largely absent from the pictures as figures in the landscape, a human presence is strongly marked. And some of Jem's texts report the conversations on the people he meets and talks with in the course of his work, walking and cycling. Water is a key presence in the work in various forms: clouds, seas, rivers, streams, pools, ponds. And water is part of a wider sense of flux and fluidity in stories of landscape change, narratives of making and unmaking, formation and dissolution, with a strong sculptural sense of shaping the land, particular morphologies of landscape, and the wider histories and geographies implicated in a particular site. There is a strong, sometimes somber sense, a mythical sense of landscape, of deep time, of biblical flood, of geological time. Themes of ruin, at least partial redemption, pollution and the struggles for reclamation, and I think a specific West Country culture that resides not just in the places close to where he has lived and worked, mineral, metallurgical, but also maybe in an Atlantic-facing hydrology. And also, I think, in a dissenter sensibility wherever he works. So Clouds Descending, the title of a work of 2008 on Cumbria, a book and an exhibition, is more than a matter of mountain mists, but taken from the title of a Wesleyan hymn on the second coming, "Lo he comes with clouds descending." Southern's practice of sustained attachment to a place of patient observation through repeated visits is expressed through the use of a large format 8x10 camera, part of a heavy load of kit. And in the 2010 Art and Environment Conference that we organised at Tate Britain, he explained this in relation to this picture. Early on, I started using a lens that rendered, even with this system, an exceptional degree of peripheral detail. This led me to pay more forensic attention to the myriad narratives that a view contains. In one photograph, a thin line of ice follows the bank of a river. A large dog has recently made its way onto the soft sand of the bank. The river level has recently receded 5 or so inches, leaving a small tide line of fine twigs. And 2 light stalks are all that remain visible from the profusion of Himalayan balsam. And furthermore, the organic material left from the early autumn floods on higher branches, alder trees that leave over the river. Hundreds of dark dots that are the remains of last year's fruit. And they repay enormous attention, these pictures. And such forensic attention can sometimes put some of the conventional landscape taxonomies into question, raising conceptual as well as topographic issues of the accepted makings and meanings of water. So the title of this talk was called "What is a River?" In the anthology Landscape Stories, the place and the power of water shifts. It opens with a section from the Red River of 1989, a series surveying the valley of a small tinning stream in Cornwall running just 7 miles to the sea, no more than a few yards across, coloured red by the minerals of the region. But what the valley lacks in length or the stream in width is made up by the depth of the landscape at 2,000 feet of this former mining country, often flooded mining shafts. And the series charts a series of valley profiles and sections, and many apparently waterless pictures, gardens, fields, buildings, interiors, but the river is always there by implication. The later sections in landscape stories, mainly from a collection called The Shape of Time, focus on contact zones of earth and water at river mouths, rockfalls, and ponds. The River Mouth series partly grew out of a desire, he said, to imagine the earth engulfed by water. And Rockfalls tells of apocryphal stories of physical geographers who spend their lives observing the slow progress of rocks down mountainsides, tiny rivulets of particles, opening up the idea of the earth as in a permanently fluid state. Ponds of various kinds and formation feature upland dew ponds, occasional ponds made by rivers during winter floods, ponds formed by seepage into quarried pits. But there's nothing pretty about these ponds. They're mesmerizing, meditative in a way like Thoreau's Walden Pond. In Southern's words, mirrored discs that reflect the heavens, but also sumps that might suck you down into the earth. This series, titled Upton Pine, not only exemplifies the complexities of pond life and landscape, but also the natural and historical cross-currents in his work, from the building and cultivation in the valley of the Red River to the transformations of the space and time, of the shape of time. And it's a landscape story of small-scale movements over a 5-year period and 3 episodes. Upton Pine is a village 5 miles northwest of Exeter, now a farming, part commuter settlement, but once part of the industrial history of the city. On the edge of the village, the pond is the site of a former manganese mine, worked from 1770 to around 1815. A celebrated mine, according to a visit I found in a collection called Chemical Essays of 1810, which supplied most of Britain's manganese, leased by 2 Exeter merchants, one commemorated in the church, much of it sent to Bristol to clarify molten glass of its green tint, or to the potteries to create a purple glaze for Egyptian ware. 150 feet, or 26 fathoms as the depth was measured, in 2 shafts with a slope to cut the stuff out. It was always wet, not drained by pumps, always liable to flood. And with abandonment, it slowly filled down from the hill in the upper village. If a key event after the war was the dumping of spoil from a new building development, and the pond only appears in maps in the last 30 years or so. Named after the colour of the ore, it was once known as the Black Pit, and it may appear part of the darker side of this landscape below the red soils and rock of the overlying sandstone. But such industrial sites were traditional enough in this region and many others. It's part of a large 3,000-acre estate, which mined as it farmed, or at least leased the mineral workings. But if the more recent member of the Earls of Iddlesey, the landowners, seem intent on creating a different kind of heritage, on the basis of a presumed visit by Jane Austen, which is completely undocumented and may well have never happened. One of the early 20th century earls claimed that this village around the mansion were the inspiration for the village of Barton in Sense and Sensibility. And in current Austen literature, this has now become local legend. The fact of estate ownership, if not stewardship of the pond, with the various sellings off and tenancies, has contributed to some of the tangled narratives that are charted in this series, the edginess of it all. It challenges the idea of what a village pond should look like. One of the tenants of the pond began transforming it into his idea of a more Arcadian realm, burning and clearing, introducing ducks and geese and flowers. And while his efforts remained ultimately unrealized, the task was taken on again, with signs of hard-won changes and defeats. That boat gradually moves around the banks during the course of this series and gradually rots as trees collapse, sheds fall in, farm machinery increases. An orange crate slips down the bank, a duck waddles down on the other bank. It is a kind of landscape gardening, echoing what is always latent in images of landscape improvement, like Reptonian-style transformation scenes, the power of local entanglements of nature and society, and that of longer and wider historical geographies of city and country. The third part, an epilogue, pans away from the banks of the place to put the pond in a wider geographical perspective. The village church on one hand, but also on the right hand of the pond by a farm track looking out over the wider landscape. It brings to mind the work of that doyen of Devon landscape historians, W.G. Hoskins, an Exeter man from an old yeoman family, a man attentive to the geological structure and scenery, localism, which was part of Hoskins' rather low church liberalism. He was a liberal councillor in Exeter. In his 1953 book on Devon, Hoskins noted the manganese mine under Exeter's industry and trade, but his entry on Upton Pine focuses on the church and the view north here towards the Exe Valley, to the hills of Radden, I'm quoting, over a countryside of the fertile red sandstones. At any time of the year, this is one of the most satisfying views in Devon. The presence of ponds in the history of British art is an intriguing issue. From the cursory surveys I've made, there appear to be remarkably few compared with other bodies of water, lakes on one hand, small pools on the other, until well into the 19th century, when it appears to become a central motif in a range of illustration, ponds of all kind, from mill ponds to duck ponds. And there are wider issues here about the place of ponds in an expanding field of village garden and industrial scenes, and also the expansion of water surfaces out of the summer, including so-called dreary landscapes of filled ditches, swollen streams, spring floods, muddy fields, and puddled tracks. It's not just a matter of Victorian Britain being wetter, but also in all European states associated with water, of matters of disease, crop productivity, irrigation, and drainage. The imagery of marshes and pools is prevalent in the imagery and sometimes the titles of exhibited pictures of the Barbizon School in France, and sometimes discussed in relation to programs of drainage and reclamation. The pond that comes to my mind as a motif is Branch Hill Pond on Hampstead Heath, featuring in a series of Constable's works. It's a flooded quarry, huge quantities of sand extracted principally for road building in London by the Lord of the Manor, in what it's tempting to call an urban edgeland of the time, one that hovered at the time, according to local observers, between desecration and recovery. The whole face of the heath has become so mutilated that the prospect of beauty is nearly destroyed, one observer reported in 1806, before the landscape attracted picnickers as well as livestock. A current renewal of interest in Constable is addressing the artist's hydrological imagination, theoretically as well as empirically, in his many sites, from fords to mill streams, clouds to channels, water meadows to thunder showers, a natural theology as well as a natural philosophy, the traditional providential schema of the water cycle, as well as more modern diagrams of meteorology. And I'm thinking here of Constable's texts as well as his pictures, his letters and the lectures later in life, in which he comments on the hydrography of old masters, on Poussin's winter of the biblical deluge. No greater power, no greater proof of the effective power of landscape than this event should have been told by landscape alone. The Mosaic text, said Constable, tells of rain only, but Poussin tells more. And of Rysdale's windmill, Constable insists that the artist has told a story, that even though the ground is covered with snow, the picture represents an approaching thaw, indicated by the direction of the mill, the clouds opening, and not just a thaw, but a thaw before morning. I want to end with a more art-critical framework, which takes us into a world of political meteorologies, of the presumed effects of weather and climate on art and creativity. Contrasting what he called the views of polished Europe with British genius, James Barrie was one of a number of critics who challenged a continental discourse, blaming the damp climate of Britain for the mediocrity of the nation's art and, in general, its cultural capacity, rehabilitating its climatic regime, redrawing the map of creativity to move the zone of artistic progress north, a refreshing world of commerce and action. And the issue seeps into a famous letter of Constable to John Fisher in 1823, when he was working on Salisbury Cathedral from the Meadows, on being doomed not to see Italy, but satisfied by England's happy land, including an approving quote from Wordsworth on green leaves and torrents, followed by an amused, sardonic inclusion of a comment by Henry Fuseli, playing up the professor of painting's strong Swiss-German accent. The letter says, "I like de landscape of Constable, he delights in de right places, but he makes me call for my greatcoat and umbrella." The following year, Constable exhibited to great acclaim at the Salon in Paris 3 pictures, now known as the Haywain, and View on the Stour in the Huntington on the right. And also there was a view, which I'm not sure what picture it is, of Hampstead Heath. And the pictures were titled quite specifically in the catalogue in terms of watercourses, fording, navigating, etc. In 1828, in the midst of his discussion of the Salon, in the Revue de Débat, the critic Delacluse looked back on this landmark display to comment on the effect that Constable had had on young French artists. So, translate, at the Salon of 1824, we saw 2 English paintings by Monsieur Constable. In these landscapes, the transparency of the tones was excessive. The effect was good for our landscape painters. It made them recognize their colors were heavy and dull. But les marécages de Monsieur Constable, the marshes and swamps of or what we call it, with us also a fashionable success, repeatedly imitated. And so while we might take that word figuratively to mean a kind of swampy ground that the English artists had tempted French painters onto, we might also consider it at face value, pointing to the liquid qualities of modern English painting perceived in France. It's the work of Paul Huet that we can grasp something tangible as to what Constable's example meant. Huet was well known for his advocacy of Constable in 1824 and made his own debut in 1827 at the Salon, and known for his fluvial preoccupations. Seine floods are an occasional motif in his earlier paintings, but it's only mid-career that Constable's Haywain seems to explicitly inform one of his ambitious works, this one, L'Inondation à Saint-Cloud, the flood at Saint-Cloud, at the level of composition, spatial structure, and motif. It was painted for the prestigious Exposition Universelle of 1855 and came to be regarded as a masterpiece acquired by the French state. It shows the Seine in flood, and commentators stress the sublime aspects of the flood, picking up on the reference to the deluge in Poussin's Winter. But we might also look at it as closer to more mundane scenery in terms of the Seine's floods as benign, cyclical, and ultimately productive rather than destructive. But the image of floodwaters rushing through the trees at the edge of one of the great landscape parks of the Ancien Regime has an undeniable resonance quite distinct from anything in Constable. So this talk has covered a lot of watery ground in a short time, discursive as well as pictorial, landscape history as well as landscape art, through the aperture of work by 2 artists from different eras. And a large number of issues, it seems to me, remain to be explored, especially about global and local relations in landscape and what Sarah this morning called the pressure of empire in the 19th century, of ice fields and swamps, whether for avenues of exploration or barriers to settlement. But landscape as both the material world and a field of vision, it seems to me, still offers a frame of knowledge for such matters in a dialogue between past and present, between landscape then and landscape now. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Kelly Presutti, Kelly recently completed her doctoral dissertation at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology with Terroir After the Terror, Landscape and Representation in 19th Century France, a study of French landscape and reform. Currently, as a Caird Fellow at the National Maritime Museum, she is conducting a study on the exchanges and dialogues between British and French maritime representational strategies. Her research has been supported by Harvard Center for European Studies, the Bourse Chateaubriand, the Getty Foundation, and I'm glad to say the Huntington, among others. She has presented her recent work at the British Library, the College Art Association, and the Mahindra Center for the Humanities at Harvard. Ms. Presutti's paper today, Strategic Seascapes, Artists in the Service of the Royal Navy, is a reevaluation of maritime imagery as a tool for defense as well as for the construction of national identity. Please welcome Kelly Presutti.
I'll begin with this watercolor view of the Spanish coast by John Thomas Serres, part of a two-page spread from his sketchbook. And I say part of because these images are excessively horizontal. They're quite difficult to fit to the proportions of a PowerPoint slide, so in many cases they're cropped. In many ways, this image is peaceful, an almost picturesque vision of the coastline, a survey of the rolling hills and rocky outcroppings, complete with hazy skies and gentle waves. Detailed renderings of several ships at sail animate the composition and activate the scene. It is not immediately distinct, then, from countless studies produced by maritime painters in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The image's tranquil appearance conceals, however, its concern with strategy, a concern embedded in the very conditions of its making. Serres produced this sketch in the midst of the French Revolutionary Wars, while working aboard a warship as an artist in the service of the Admiralty. The picturesque vision is undergirded by an emphasis on precise information, and as a result, Serres's images are typically read for what they might tell us about topography, vessels, tides, tack, and trim. Read, that is, like maps. But this image can also tell us about a particular kind of vision, about ways of seeing, knowing, and communicating place that were being actively worked out in the early 19th century. John Thomas Serres was the son of renowned maritime painter and founding member of the Royal Academy, Dominic Serres. After his father's death in 1793, he took over his post as marine painter to the king. But in 1799, he became entangled with another mode of maritime representation, hydrography, the science of surveying bodies of water, a discipline that was itself in transformation in the 1790s, as the state established its first hydrographic office. Serres was contracted by the Admiralty Board of the Royal Navy to produce images of the French coastline in support of a blockade of Brest, one of France's primary naval ports. The blockade was an important part of Britain's strategy, but the Admiralty Board, which notably included landsmen unaccustomed to the conventions of naval charts, lacked an adequate account of the Brittany coast. So sketches like this one, a scene that, as we will see, appears remarkably calm given its wartime status, would presumably assist the board in determining the appropriate placement of ships to avoid the rocky cliffs and the strong tides for which the Brittany coast was notorious. Serres's images were intended to give the Admiralty a picture of sites of potential action. They were also later engraved on charts for the purposes of navigation. As such, they stand as a concrete instance of the intersection between military and landscape representation. Much work has been done on the contribution of strategies of representation to techniques of warfare. Scholars including Nick Alfrey and Stephen Daniels, of course, have further focused on the direct involvement of artists with military draftsmanship and cartographic pursuits, notably Paul and Thomas Sandby. And Serres, too, was concerned with accuracy, with recording topography and producing a readable image. He also, however, brought art to his task, deliberately so, as we will see. He generated an image of the coastline that was at once authoritative and imaginative, one that distinctly responded to the needs of the Admiralty in this moment. For the members of the Admiralty Board in their quarters in London, images provided the only contact with war. Both Serres's views and more standard charts, like the one on the bottom left, were ways of mediating the distance and enabling decision-making at a remove. Yet both types of images dealt with an inherently unstable subject, the sea and the war, and both the picturesque views and the diagrammatic charts struggled to balance informational uncertainty with representational authority. The Secretary of the Admiralty, Evan Nepean, wrote of Serres's commission, "I have engaged Mr. Serres, the marine painter, to go out in one of the ships from Plymouth for the purpose of taking views of Brest. It is somewhat extraordinary that there is not one view of that port or any part of the coast in its vicinity to be found in this or any other of the public offices. Views of that description give landsmen a better idea than the best constructed charts." So the commission reflects the admittedly poor state of hydrographic knowledge in Britain at the time. In addition to filling a gap in state records, however, selecting Serres, an artist, to paint the coast suggests a desire on the part of the Admiralty to have a fuller picture, to have something better than, as Nepean put it, the best constructed charts. Understanding the kinds of information charts conveyed and how they asserted their authority is essential to understanding the stakes and the innovations of Serres's sketches. So the best constructed charts in the 1790s were those produced by the recently founded Hydrographic Office, staffed by Alexander Dalrymple. Dalrymple had previously worked privately for the East India Company. The formation of a state office was an effort to centralize and to control this crucial intelligence. British pilots had long relied on foreign charts, like the French example you see here on the right, for navigation, a situation that was increasingly worrying, especially in the context of war with France. So Dalrymple's task was to organize and to assess a mess of potentially unreliable sources and represent them in a standardized form. In many cases, this entailed transforming numbers into images, plotting lead line soundings sent back to the office by sailors onto a spatial plane with regard to a shoreline. Dalrymple's challenge at a physical and temporal distance from the site was to plumb an ever-changing reality for some markers of stability. Hydrographic data only functions if it can be trusted, and much of the representational convention of the Hydrographic Office was about producing authority. This first published Admiralty chart of Quiberon Bay in Brittany gives a sense of Dalrymple's approach. He developed a style based in clean lines and a lack of unnecessary ornamentation. He eliminated the rhumb lines or the compass lines that had crisscrossed earlier charts, replacing them with small ticks along the frame. For Dalrymple, the ideal chart was, he wrote, quote, "a specimen of hydrographical engraving in which everything useful is inserted and nothing but what is useful." To further avoid cluttering the sheet, Dalrymple had even negotiated to have his name woven into the bottom left corner of special paper molds, circumventing the need for an unsightly central watermark or signature. The weave of the paper, then, would attest to the correctness of the Admiralty's vision. These charts, in their austerity, effectively screen out the forces that were actively challenging their accuracy: waves, winds, and shifting sands, the transient aspects of the sea that make sailing such an art. Dalrymple's charts work to escape the contingency of representation and instead approach the status of a diagram, wherein every mark conveys meaningful information without excess or ambiguity. Stamped with the seal of the office, the same seal in use today, Dalrymple's charts participate in what historian Simon Schaefer has termed, quote, "a seemingly silent, impersonal economy," one that would, Schaefer continues, "make the inscription techniques of British navigational science workable and authoritative then and now." Charts continue to be republished long after they're first made. They're still being published today. Dalrymple's efforts to modernize hydrographic knowledge reveal strategies of representation designed to visually convey impersonal authority across time and space. So the charts, which focused on the outline of the coast and the depth of the sea, were often accompanied by coastal profiles like these, intended to give captains visual cues to navigation as they approached the shoreline, which was the most dangerous moment of the voyage. These woodcut coastal profiles from the longest-running piloting guide, John Sellers' The English Pilot, are the most basic example of the form. Highly schematic, fragmented silhouettes, it's hard to imagine these were of much actual use. Dalrymple himself was forced to admit this, writing in 1807, quote, "It also seems proper to state my opinion concerning pilotage, which appears, in general, to be merely an art, acquired by experience and resting on judgment and memory, without science, and consequently impossible to be communicated to another person." Coastal profiles, then, were as much a cultural practice as they were a practical necessity. Faced with the impossibility of communicating the art of navigation, charts and coastal profiles, the assembled data and information, instead broker an encounter with the unknown, offering an attempt to make distant lands at least feel recognizable and familiar through image. And that's also, in essence, what Serres was doing in his depictions for the Admiralty, making visible not just the actuality of the Atlantic coast, but also attempting to picture the unknown space of war. He did this through a reliance on art. To give the Admiralty a view better than the best constructed charts, Serres spent 2 summers sailing aboard warships, eventually traveling the length of France's Atlantic coast and covering parts of Spain. He produced a sketchbook full of views like this one, in addition to a number of loose watercolors. These images were brought back to London for the purposes of naval action, and they carry the strategic in both the method of their making and the mode of representation. Serres adopted the exaggerated horizontal format of the coastal profiles, but he reinserted those fragments into a coherent picture. While there are degrees of finish, the most highly worked images, like this one, exhibit the characteristics of maritime painting privileged in Britain at this time: a harmony of composition, a union of sea, sky, and sail. Serres created fully articulated scenes incorporating temporal effects, elements of light and shade, and narrative details like the ships. Rather than reducing the sight to data points, he embellished and filled out his depiction, going beyond information to produce a sense of place. Unlike the atemporal charts designed to stand outside of time, Serres's deliberately contingent scenes encourage a narrative engagement and enable the kind of future projection inherent to strategic thinking. Serres's images, in turn, generate an alternate sort of authority to Dalrymple's woven paper and the hydrographic office stamp, one grounded in his direct and presumably unmediated encounter with the coastline. The convincing illusion of space, combined with the stylistic immediacy of his scenes, a sense of atmosphere, a distinct but unfussy posing of color, gives his image the kind of eyewitness authority prevalent, as Sam Smiles has noted, in topographical painting of the time. While Dalrymple, as his portrait showed us, primarily worked from his cabinet, in the only depiction we have of Serres, he has placed himself amidst the hustle and the bustle of a port, sketching in the bottom left. He's just here. Serres was to be, as former Admiralty hydrographer and historian M.K. Barrett has put it, the eyes of the Admiralty, traveling to the site and sending back what he saw. His images participated in the construction of a mode of vision central to that governing board. Serres made note of his privileged viewing position beneath some of the images, as here, where he writes, "Drawn on board La Nymphe by J.T. Serres, 10th June. His authority was then doubled and underscored by the captain's annotation here, where he writes, "Very correct." We should not mistake, however, this correctness for a lack of art. Indeed, it is the very picturesque quality of Serres's scenes that made them valuable to the Admiralty. The aims of hydrography do not disappear within this picturesque vision, but are instead recoded in the language of art. In another view of Brest, here, Serres used the sun's rays to call attention to the primary entrance to the harbor. In equipping his images with the necessary information, he further relied on a technique first developed by his shipmate, Captain Percy Fraser, using seagulls to mark significant sites or points of interest. So you can see just here a cluster of seagulls, and it's amplified here. Here they correspond to a textual legend beneath the image. And in this slide here, they actually correspond to a visual elaboration of the lighthouse. And you have another textual legend here. In using these seagulls, Serres maintained the pictorial illusion central to his image's authority and power. So rather than using a number or writing directly on the image, the seagulls are both representational and informative, both image and data. Flickering between modes of signification, the seagulls call attention to the status of Serres's image as representation. In attempting to naturalize or neutralize the communication of strategy, Serres's images paradoxically foreground the means of communication, the mediating eye and image between the admiralty and the site. Serres continued to use the seagulls when he republished images from his voyage in an updating piloting guide, The Little Sea Torch. In this page, featuring views of Gibraltar, we see yet another of his visual conventions, the inclusion of trompe-l'oeil scrolls to frame and set apart his representations. The scrolls seem to have first appeared in the context of a collaboration with Captain Percy Fraser, the same captain who shared the seagull technique with him. In this depiction of Camargue Bay, the left 2/3 of the page are given over to Serres's views, while the right third has a textual description by Fraser. The two modes of communication sit side by side, but Serres has chosen to distinguish his through the illusion of a curling page, visually lifting his image off the sheet and setting it apart. The inclusion of the scroll expresses a sense of the continuous scanning of the coast by boats on patrol. And Serres may have been referencing contemporaneous scroll maps, like the one that we saw in Dalrymple's portrait here, or the ones that were on the walls of the Admiralty boardroom. He could also be referring to the newly emergent technology of the panorama, foreshadowing his own involvement in the production of a panorama of Boulogne. But in the trompe-l'oeil, he was also making a comment about art and its place in the increasingly rarefied and bureaucratic hydrographic office. In seemingly deliberate counter to Dalrymple's demands for nothing but what is useful, Serres inserted an adornment, a folly that serves as a reminder of the artful uncertainty of navigation and the inherent artifice of any representational convention. The scrolls remind us that the entire image is a sort of trompe-l'oeil, a visual conceit approximating immediacy and certainty despite the distance and the confusion of the war. Beyond the comment of the scrolls, Serres's most remarkable assertion of his art is in the absence of any signs of tumult or unrest in his images. In the midst of war, the skies are unfailingly clear, the waters resolutely still. Faced with the windy, turbulent Atlantic, Serres calmed the seas, producing agency over the scene that echoed the Admiralty's desire to dominate the coast and control the passage of French ships. It is a calm that seems to be in tension with Serres's invocation of an eyewitness authority. This calm can be partially attributed to the blockade, the very purpose of which was inaction. Yet the deliberate tranquility of Serres's images also works to convey visual and physical control over the site, a control reinforced in the narrative details.
Yeah. I think he's working on it. Yeah. No, he hasn't turned it on yet. Not yet.
Not just yet. Hello? All right. I'll just carry on. No? Okay. Sure. Yeah? Hello?
Yes. Wonderful.
Right. So I was talking to you about how wonderfully calm these images are, which if you've been to Brittany, you might realize is very rarely the case. So the calm, as I was saying, can partially be attributed to the blockade, the very purpose of which was inaction. Yet the deliberate tranquility of Serres' images also works to convey visual and physical control over the site, a control reinforced in the narrative details. So in the entrance to Brest, a well-placed ship, this one here, is poised to cut across the only passage in or out of the harbor, beyond which the masts of dozens of French ships remain at anchor. In providing the Admiralty with this information and affording them this vision, Serres was facilitating the maintenance of the status quo, the ongoing blockade, the privileged position of the British with regard to the French coast. These images actively produce the peace they appear to document. They are images that anticipate and promise the reality they represent. Serres' images, then, were useful to the Admiralty because they offered a counterpoint to the starkness of charts at a moment when a degree of imagination and projection was called for. In later years, they continued to supplement hydrographic data, but without the imaginative leeway of the originals. So in 1807, his sketches of the Brittany coast were engraved as part of a chart of the Bay of Brest. So you can see that this is all the chart. These are Serres' sketches here. And here's a detail. The engraver has wiped the views of their picturesque quality, leaving the skies blank. The seagulls and the scrolls are gone, as is the sense of continuity and coherence within the scene, as the views have been cut to isolate specific features. They've been transformed into what Bruno Latour would term an immutable mobile, their temporality erased. They are no longer of their moment, no longer deliberately contingent, but instead rendered atemporal and reproducible. Serres' images are, however, positioned at a right angle to the chart itself, forcing the user to physically turn the paper to move between modes of representation. It is as though they retain a lingering trace of their pictorialism, a trace that makes them out of keeping with the regular and regulated order of the chart. In this image, we see an ongoing struggle to reconcile data and vision, information and picture, as well as a persistent desire for both modes of depiction. Studying Serres' sketches offers a glimpse, then, into a point of contact between hydrography and art, at a moment when both were establishing conventions and conditions of representation. Serres' time with the Admiralty continued to impact his artistic production, in many cases directly so, as he generated finished paintings from those wartime sketches. In 1815, for example, he painted a scene of shipping at Ferrol, relying on an earlier watercolor view for the topography. While the Ferrol scene engages more directly in the picturesque, leading the eye into the background through alternating darks and lights, showing more animated scenes, including a narrative vignette of a dinghy being rigged for sail, all set against a strikingly pink atmospheric sky. It retains the strategic vision of the original. For all its apparent banality, Serres' later scene of shipping at Ferrol participated in assuring Britain's hegemony over the seas just as much as the images produced for the Admiralty. The Ferrol painting was likely made for Artillery Commander Major General Sir Alexander Dickinson, one of 3 scenes commissioned to commemorate specific naval victories. Indeed, most of Serres' patrons, most patrons of maritime painting, were naval officers, suggesting the genre's perpetual engagement with a strategic mode of viewing and visualizing place. Maritime painting offered a means of representation that responded to the needs of those tasked with traveling to and securing distant waters. Maintaining Britain's position was not a question of mapping alone, not merely a matter of information. It was also about vision and envisioning. In short, it required the services of art. Thank you.
Our final speaker on this panel is Gill Perry. Gill Perry is an Emeritus Professor of Art History at the Open University. Among her many publications are Women Artists and the Parisian Avant-Garde, Gender in Art, Difference and Excess in Contemporary Art, and just to cut it short, because we're running a long session right now, Spectacular Flirtations, Viewing the Actress in British Art. Since 2004, she has devoted much time to researching the role of home, gender, and the everyday in art and visual culture, with such publications as Placing Faces, The Portrait in the English Country House, and Playing at Home, The House in Contemporary Art. Professor Perry's most recent work includes the publications Playing with Michael Landry, forthcoming in 2018, and perhaps most closely related to her paper today, a forthcoming book titled Islands in Contemporary Art. Please welcome Gill Perry.
Okay, repronounced as Nowhere is Land, and made up of soil and rocks taken from an island that had appeared in the Norwegian archipelago of Svalbard in the high Arctic. The land was revealed as the result of the retreating Sonklabrien glacier, a direct effect. Oh, that was a view on the, slightly put off my guard then, from the Devon coast. You can just see it in the distance there. The Sonklabrien glacier, and a direct effect of global warming. Hartley claimed to have discovered this island in 2004 on the Cape Farewell Arctic expedition, when he found it absent from all existing maps and charts. There followed a lengthy correspondence with the Norwegian authorities and governor of Svalbard, in which Hartley sought to name and claim the island as a secessionist micronation with multinational citizens, its own governor, and a constitution devised by its citizens. Nowhere Island, and there we are again. Needless to say, this was part of this much longer, drawn-out story in which Hartley was refused a claim on the island, but eventually won permission to remove a small part of Naimark, as he named it, and towed it south in 2012, declaring its independence and establishing it as an island nation seeking citizens from around the world. 23,003 people from 135 countries signed up to be citizens of Nowhere Island on its website and through its embassy, which I'll come back to. Although this happened in 2010 to 12, the irony of what it signifies in the wake of the 2017 Brexit vote to assert the UK's separate island status, reduce immigration, and supposedly take back control is hard to ignore. I want to argue that Nowhere Island challenged many themes and tropes, not only of nationhood, mobility, and islandness, but also of the perceived relationship of place and space to landscape. As a mobile, participatory, and transitory landscape, a durational project, it undermines any sense of a landscape being apparently natural or fixed. As a participatory project, it also clouds the boundaries between representation and the real, and reminds us of the problem of what constitutes the archive. Perhaps surprisingly, Nowhere Island was one of many major art commissions supported by the Arts Council and other Olympic funders. Many of the other more centrally cited Olympic commissions were, of course, designed to affirm the UK's status as an internationally esteemed creative hub, and London as a site for Olympic and Olympian display. Anish Kapoor gets a black background, by the way. Much better known is the monumental tower, even Colossus, that is Anish Kapoor's orbit. 114 meters high, boasts 455 steps, and is now graced with the world's longest tunnel slide by Carsten Holler. Thought to be the tallest sculpture in the UK, it's nearly 7 meters taller than the Statue of Liberty. Its 23 million cost was largely financed by the steel magnate, industrious ArcelorMittal. Praised by some as an awe-inspiring feat of modern engineering, and critiqued by others as a hubristic vanity project pursued by Mayor Boris Johnson, he's come up again, it has transformed the East London skyline, reshaping that London landscape as a brazen celebration of its Olympic past. According to the press release, it has unparalleled views of the entire 250 acres of the Olympic Park and London skyline from a special viewing platform. Yet both these projects were pursued and developed as part of the UK's Olympic celebrations, as evidence of its thriving creative industries. But they could be seen as diametrically opposed commissions, that is, in what they sought to and have been seen to represent. Of course, one was at sea, one is profoundly urban. orbit was hubristically reaching to the skies, like a cathedral, creating and revealing, apparently, new London landscapes, especially the highly symbolic Olympic skyline. The viewing platform created a new panoramic vista, a celebratory landscape of an expanding capital city. This is a quote from the site, by the way, and an attempt to show you some of that panoramic vista. It was helping then to construct a new narrative of the London landscape. In contrast, Nowhere Island suggested a bleak Arctic topography, barren, rocky, icy, anti-picturesque. And this was also anti-local in some sense, anti-nation state. It was a visiting island nation, perpetually mobile, against ideas of single national identity, and paradoxically uninhabited, although it did have a mobile embassy, and this followed it on land. But Hartley's project was also creating new, albeit transitory, landscapes. As it was towed around the south coast, it transformed some of those Devon holiday landscapes. As captured, of course, by the camera lens. Beach holidays, postcard views were interrupted and altered with the presence of this strange floating island. No one was more surprised than Hartley when the Arts Council agreed to sponsor his provocative project. He is convinced, and I think he's right, that it would never have seen the light of day if he had proposed it in the current political climate. Even then, of course, there was controversy. The Daily Mail, our favourite paper, of 2011 included an angry feature. I'm quoting now. The Arts Council is spending a staggering $500,000 on floating a huge piece of Arctic rock more than 2,000 miles from Norway to England. The project has been hailed by artists as an important and innovative way of looking at the dangers posed by climate change, but critics have branded it a complete waste of public money. An online forum produced some furious responses about wasting taxpayers' money and other more flippant criticisms, including, "I can't stand these hypocrites who bleat on about climate change and then proceed to tow a huge chunk of ordinary rock around on a barge to raise awareness. What a load of cobblers." Someone else asked if it had a Tesco's. To return to the complex history of this project. Hartley's trip to the Arctic in 2004, when he discovered, as he claimed, his island, was documented as part of a show at the Natural History Museum called The Ship in 2006. Named after the ship they'd travelled in, it showed the works and photographic records of several Cape Farewell expeditions that took artists and writers to the high Arctic. It was also included as part of the Liverpool Biennale of that year. Hartley's installation uses photographs of the Discovery and the Cape Farewell expedition, the remote Arctic landscape, and framed letters to and from the Norwegian government. This is a good reply from them. In response to his request, I think we've had another accident, but I'm not using it anyway, am I? Am I still on? Okay.
I'll come and fiddle
Well,
with
it's
it.
okay. You don't need to fiddle with me. I think is it still working?
Yeah, pop it there.
Okay. Thank you. Hartley's installation, as I said, included these framed photographs, and one of them was a framed version of various versions of various bits of correspondence, including this reply to his claim to secede and create a separate nation and constitution. As the artist intended, these documents used landscape and text to chart what Claire Doherty has called a deliberate act of colonization. Several photos of Hartley staking his claim. I'm giving you enough time, I hope, to read that because it's rather good. Several photos of Hartley staking his claim on Naimark are mischievously transgressive, spiking the absurd heroics of colonial conquest, rather relevant to some of today's papers, I thought. This installation and installation of photographs, in effect, also provides a vivid example of the archive actually being orchestrated by the artist to become part of the ongoing work. Hartley self-consciously displays his own camera lens. By 2010, Hartley knew he'd been shortlisted for the artist taking the lead award for the Southwest, Arts Council England's flagship project for the 2012 Olympics. He won the commission, and this helped him to finally persuade the Norwegian government to allow him to remove part of the island, sail it out into international waters, and tow it around the southwest coast. So in 2010, he set sail again to the Svalbard archipelago with an expedition team of 17, retracing the earlier voyage. Instead of the more scientific team of geologists and climate change scientists who'd accompanied the Cape Farewell trip, people were selected who might form the foundations of the new nation. These included a human geographer, psychologist, linguist, feminist journalist, environmental activist, lawyer, educationalist, and magician. Once they'd broken off bits of rock and soil and floated them into international waters, a declaration of independence was made, along with an invitation to citizenship, which could be made online or at the mobile embassy. And this embassy was opened at each subsequent port of call. It arrived in Weymouth on the 25th of July, 2012, 4 days before the Olympic sailing races took place at Weymouth Bay. Nowhere Island then continued its slow journey around the southwest coast as an open visiting nation hosted by Devon and Cornwall's famous ports, towns, and cities. Celebrations were held in each port. You could sign up at the embassy and also look at its collection of archived objects. It ended up in Bristol. You can see what fun they're all having. It ended up in Bristol, leaving the port on the 9th of September to be broken into pieces, which were sent to each of its 23,003 citizens all over the world. Nowhere Island has much to contribute, I think, to the debates that surround notions of place, traditionally a major concern of geographers. Of course, place, like space and home, is a profoundly interdisciplinary concept, and like home, has been appropriated, reviewed, and contested by scholars of art history and visual culture. In this conference, we've already been exploring something of the history and idea of landscape as a visual concept and as a local material topography. The geographer Tim Cresswell has argued that, and I quote, in most definitions of landscape, the viewer is outside of it, and that is the primary way in which it differs from place. That's very much simplification, as Cresswell himself would say. Place is seen then, in contrast with landscape, according to this definition, as a lived experience, a social construction around an identifiable neighborhood or geographical area. Place then is a spatial imaginary tied to a landscape. Oops, doesn't matter. It is heavily invested with meaning, which is social, political, cultural, and so on. But what Hartley's work tells us is that landscape, that is the visual artistic project, can be equally unstable. It is both literally and metaphorically a floating signifier. The aesthetic and political economies of Nowhere Island are explicitly linked, which leads me nicely to the important role of islands, or artistic representations thereof, in a dynamic contemporary notion of landscape, again, perhaps echoing this concern with ideas of liquid landscapes. So in an era wrestling with problems of climate change, migration, globalization, not to mention those post-Brexit fantasies, the theme of the island resonates with literal and metaphorical possibilities and has done so for many contemporary British artists. And Hartley's Floating Island acknowledges the important legacy of artists such as Robert Smithson and the Danish artist Andrea Zittel. I don't have any time here, of course, to mention the rich literary legacy on islands that I'm ploughing through at the moment. In 2005, Smithson's Floating Island was launched off the island of Manhattan. Never conceived in his lifetime, he died in 1973. It was constructed from his drawings. A large barge, landscaped with trees, rocks, and shrubs from New York's Central Park, was towed around Manhattan Island. It offered an artificial and displaced island, a kind of counter to Manhattan, visible along the Hudson River. As such, of course, it drew attention to our tenuous relationship to land, place, and the natural world, and has many concerns that are shared in the conception of Nowhere Island. Zittel's A to Z pocket property of 1999 is a 44-ton floating concrete island which she anchored off the coast of Denmark. She actually lived in it for a month as an experiment in escapism and isolation. It's also an exploration of our notions of place. Hartley is clearly indebted to both these artists, but I think there are some interesting differences. Hartley and Smithson self-consciously take fragments of rock, and this is the fragments theme has been running through today, which I think is interesting. He took fragments, like Smithson, from the site and placed them in the embassy archive. He transplanted them, changing their narrative histories. But the point about using fragments there is a point about using fragments, I think, that is central to the narrative of Nowhere Island. Rocks, pebbles, walrus bones, and other local objects found on Naimark were displayed in the mobile land-based embassy that followed the floating island around the south coast. There is, of course, an ironic nod here to fossil culture that was mentioned earlier. This included a tiny piece of moon rock found on the island, and this constituted a part of both the work and the archive. Tanya Kovacs, who was part of the expedition, described the fluid and, as she saw it, even global function of this archive. One of the objects in the Nowhere Island embassy, I'm quoting her now, was a tiny fragment of lunar meteorite. The object was the smallest item in the archive, yet it added the most to reflections on the nature of mobile territories. Nothing you could catch could bring you closer from something further away. At the same time, such objects were often perceived as evidence of the islandness of the project. Fragments provide archival evidence of its geological distinctiveness, its presence as part of the bleak, rocky formations of the Arctic Circle. Other artistic imaginings or reworkings of the island theme by contemporary British artists are often merged with images or representations of home or dwelling. Ideas of islandness, identity and dwelling or inhabiting are often enmeshed in life as in representation. And I'm just digressing quickly here to show you Rachel Whiteread's cabin on the hills of the Governor's Island overlooking New York, which is a negative concrete cast of the interior of a simple cabin. And the solitary nature of this installation, a simple space for introspection perhaps, is accentuated, of course, by the island site. It's cut off from the metropolitan mainland, which is at the same time all too visible on the horizon. Hartley himself has also engaged with this island theme in some of his earlier works, as have many other artists who've been drawn to the Scottish Islands. Altenbarger's Mirror House on the left, and on the right is Hartley's work on Skye. Hartley's work is always performative in some kind of way. Can you see him? He's actually climbing the house climbing this little croft on Skye. It is renowned for his practice of so-called buildering. This often involves a transgressive activity of scaling or climbing or trespassing in and on buildings. This happens on many of his Scottish works, as in his series from the Outer Hebrides. Here he exploits, as you can see, the absurd notion of scaling a simple crofter's cottage in a desolate area of this characteristically remote island. Of course, modern buildings are more often scaled for repair and cleaning in areas of affluent high-rise structures, and Hartley has done this too. Other British artists have turned the geography and geology of some of these Scottish islands, and again we've got this appeal of the if you like, northern isles into complex aesthetic projects. Alison Turnbull's work on the Scottish Cape Farewell project of 2011 to 12 chart the activities of clouds and planets over island maps. She's concerned with concepts of order, chaos, and human intervention, thus implicating climate change. And she uses it as kind of repetitive material for reconvening nature. This is her north and south. There are some other important associations of island and islandness that have engaged artists, notably Hartley, in this Nowhere Island project. This is clearly acknowledged by Hartley, that utopian ideas have directly informed his own. And the imaginative possibilities of the island have continued to inform a genre of utopian and dystopian writing for centuries, from Francis Bacon's New Atlantis to Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, Jules Verne's Floating Islands, and so on. But how can performative and visual arts, rather than written text, manage to convey utopian ideals? Richard Noble has explored this issue, citing an inevitable contradictory pull between our imaginative fantasy of a good society and the constraints, the inevitable constraints of social realities. Quote, for artworks to be utopian, they need to offer two things that seem to pull in rather different directions. On the one hand, a vision of a better place than the here and now that we inhabit, and on the other, some insight into what Bloch terms the darkness so near, the contradictions and limitations that drive our will to escape the here and now in the first place. I'd add here that when mediated through visual art, they must also deploy visual imagery, in this case a floating landscape, to somehow embody these contradictions. That is a huge part, I think, of the artistic challenge. Of course, Yoko Ono and John Lennon's conceptual country, Utopia, of 1973, I've just given you the declaration there on the right, is one notorious example of a performative and aesthetic project that asserted utopian ideals, as listed on the declaration, and that embodies this contradictory pull. The flag of Utopia was white, and John Lennon's national anthem was 4 seconds of silence. Of course, theirs was a purely conceptual country, a theatrical gesture, not an island, and even more difficult to realize perhaps than Hartley's island of statelessness, with its signed-up citizens who were also invited to propose the Constitution. For Hartley, it was the citizens, alongside the artist, who helped to develop the creative illusion. And of course, Hartley's project is marked out from its predecessors as a self-conscious, durational, time-based, floating island, perpetually changing its landscape and its performative history as it traveled from the high Arctic to southwest Britain. As such, it also reminds us that topographies of landscape are constantly evolving and enmeshed with our shifting ideas of both place and space. As my colleague, sadly recently died, Doreen Massey, has written so eloquently in a footing quote from her essay subtitled Reflections on Moving Mountains of 2006, quote, bearing in mind the movement of the rocks, both space and landscape could be imagined as provisionally intertwined simultaneities of ongoing, unfinished stories. Thank you. I'm sorry about the interruptions.
Those are three really great, very interesting papers about very different types of landscape. And I was struck, though, however, that they all seem to deal in a way with the effect of the global on the local landscape, whether it's through war and international relations or through the effects of climate and the interventions of man. So I think in the interest of getting through questions, I'm going to go ahead and open up to the floor. We have three papers and must keep on schedule. So are there any questions for the panel? Yes, behind you. Matthew.
Thanks. On the global angle, I was wondering, this is a question for Stephen Daniels, and it struck me that I don't know the contemporary photographer with whom you are dealing, but I think it was Upton Pyne in particular, and the broader practice you describe seems so clearly to evoke the work of Jeff Wall, particularly The Flooded Grave. And it strikes me that the self-conscious extension of a chemical photographic process, which it sounds like the artist is inhabiting rather than a digital practice, would evoke or call to mind Wall's essay, Photography and Liquid Intelligence, and I'm wondering where that figures in, where if that's could be a useful concept to marshal in regard to this kind of work, and more broadly, what the referencing to work that moves in a global contemporary photographic milieu allows us to see in the kind of citational practice that the artist with whom you're engaging seems to be engaged.
Well, I'm not sure about all, but I mean, the later, can you just rephrase that later part of the question about the global?
Well, let me see. Let me consult my, right. The photograph Upton Pine that you show right at the end that has this flooded aperture hole in the foreground.
Yeah.
It seems to me the date that I wrote down from that was 2000, 2010 possibly.
Yeah.
It looks to me like a very conspicuous, self-conscious reference to Wall's flooded grave, which is itself filled with all kinds of art historical references to Courbet's burial at Ornans, and so on and so forth, and an elaborately constructed digital pastiche done by Wall to look like it's a relatively benign documentary photograph. Now, you have a practitioner and your protagonist, Jem. I've repressed the last name.
Well, you know, I mean, you can ask him that question yourself over tea. He's with us today.
Oh, cheers.
So I wouldn't like to answer for him in a sense, but I think that I mean, in a sense that the genealogy I was trying to track was rather different. Is that there are those. I was more interested in situating it within broader currents of landscape history rather than a particular photographic practice.
Right. But the point would be to press on Melinda's question about the global.
Yeah.
And what we see when we follow not simply the local network of references to Hoskins and locality, but also see a globally circulating kind of referencing.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes that global, local, I mean, it's almost as if they kind of rhyme too much for me, is that there are lots of mediating terms between them that I think are useful. So, you know, local and regional and national, right, or imperial. Right? So, for example, take Upton Pine to take the issue of the mining, for example, right, is that is going to Exeter, it's going round the peninsula, it's going into Bristol, right? Glassware being exported, so it's part of a circulation system that I think it's too reductive to put local and global together. It seems to me there are a lot of mediating geographical terms that are often historically specific that we need to attend to.
But wouldn't then...
Can we check? We want to move on. We haven't got much time.
Yeah, maybe we can continue the conversation separately. Yeah. Is there other questions? Yeah, we have one over here.
My question's about the instabilities of the landscapes that were kind of presented. I was interested, sort of starting with Gill's kind of paper where you looked at Anish Kapoor and then the sort of, you know, Alex's work. There seemed to be something, you know, where the public accepted Anish Kapoor's work, which for me seemed quite phallocentric in its kind of position, where, you know, perhaps the instability of Alex's work was like, you know, slightly dismissed. And then there was interesting... Sorry.
The instability of whose work was?
Of Alex's work was slightly dismissed.
Not intentionally.
No, by the public.
Oh, by the public, yes.
And then moving on to, you know, Stephen's paper, there was a sort of instability of liquidity, which kind of affects landscape, and, you know, there's that temporality which kind of comes with liquidity. And then there's the economy of the charts with, you know, Kelly's paper that was sort of, you know, strategically trying to map those places and kind of, you know, pin down that information. So I suppose my question really is about those kind of, you know, the balance of stabilities and instabilities in landscapes.
Well, it seems to me if there was anything that united those papers, it was partly about instability and liquidity, to use the, you know, the metaphors that are running through, which of course is deeply fashionable now. I noted before I left that there'd been several events, art events of late, that had used floating or liquid in their titles. The Lyon Biennale was called Monde Flottant, Floating World. There was a whole section of the Venice Biennale. We seem to be engaged with a theme that I think is being perhaps used a bit glibly to encompass some quite complex
it can get
issues around landscape.
Yeah,
and
it
perception.
can get excessive, can't it?
Excessive
To the point where
floating, excessively
I'm,
floating.
there's a great passage in Ulysses where Bloom's turning on a tap, and it just unleashes paragraphs about water supply, not just in Dublin, but all over the world. And it's seen from the perspective of Stephen, who is a nice dry phrase, who distrusted all loquacities of thought, right? And sometimes that's my view of this, is that sometimes it's too easy.
And to be perhaps a bit less flippant too, I think that Hartley's project was certainly an artistic intention. I'm not here to sort of deify artistic intention. I think there are lots of problems and contradictions with his project that I don't have time to go into. But that his concern was to destabilise what our notions of landscape might be, but to enmesh that with notions of nationhood, identity, constitution, political constitutions, and so on. Now, some might argue that he did it very crudely. But I think to use the trope or the theme of the island to do that and to break the island away from a pre-existing island is a very literal and quite a clever way of actually suggesting that this is creating landscapes is a highly constructed, fluid process, and that maybe you want to say something with map making is similar.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that really intrigued me about the charts is that they're necessarily in dialogue with land, and that's why I thought it was so interesting to think about the seascapes in a conference on landscapes, because you can't have those charts without the shoreline. You can't have those coastal profiles without the coast. You can't picture just the floating part, and so even when you think of Alex's work, there's the complementary land-based embassy. So you sort of need those two parts.
Mobile embassy.
Mobile, yes.
It's fluid.
It is fluid, but it is on the ground, and there's something about that complementarity.
Yeah, absolutely.
I also think historically landscape gets over-codified as fixed somehow.
Yeah.
And if you look seriously at artwork historically, all of these kind of instabilities are there. It's nothing. It's not a new unsettling. It's that the unsettling has always been part of the genre.
But I suppose my point was to be able to address that and articulate it through some kind of mediation through art. In my case, performance art. In your case, photography. In your case, the representation of map making seems to me to be the $64,000 problem. How do we engage with mediation? What does it mean? And where are we coming from?
This gets back to the point of the fragmentary that we
Exactly,
talked about
fragments,
before.
yeah.
We had one over here, Tim. Yeah.
I'd just like to ask everyone, the one theme that seemed to appear in all three papers was somehow the panoramic. It's very obviously there at the moment of the invention of the 360-degree panorama painting in the oceanographic views, but it's also there, I think, Steve, I mean, that's perhaps where Jeff Wall might make his way into this, because the laterally expanded huge plate or luminous landscape painting, landscape photography of the late 20th century seems to have a kind of panoramic heritage, and then this fantastic little viewing platform wandering around the ocean with this 360-degree view, but no one standing on it, and then the kind of phallic thing in the East End with the viewing platform at the top. Is the panorama an important presence in all these papers?
I think that's an incredibly good point. I think the whole, the notion of the panorama has actually affected the way in which we use the camera lens to represent these sorts of projects. And Alex's project, because it was so barren, so bleak, you can barely see it, depended on a moving panoramic vista. I mean, I could only show you edited photographs. That was my point about being self-conscious about the blue. And his project was, at every stage, you needed a panoramic angle in order to get a sense of its islandness, the way it was relating to landscape, the way it was changing landscape, and so on. And I think your point about Jeff Wall is absolutely right. He couldn't have done many of the projects that he's doing. I don't know if there are other questioners would agree, without the technology, the panoramic technology, if you like, or without seeming to mimic panoramic technology.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, Gill, just picking up on that perhaps, and the previous question, about offshore islands and the extent to which those are being picked up on by artists. I mean, the Alex Hartley project that you talked about reminded me of, and seems very close to, the Principality of Sealand, which is, you know, from the 60s and 70s, where a working class family appropriated and then claimed as an independent state a gun platform off the Suffolk coast, and have established it as a principality with its own currency, with passports. I believe they have a government, they have football teams, in plural, I think, athletes, they send athletes to games. They have all the trappings, it would seem, of a state, and actually claim that they have been recognised by some of them. And it seems like, you know, in some ways it's a kind of a sort of mimicking, I guess, of the whole way in which private islands are used by the very wealthy, and used as a way of you know, shortcutting, circumventing, evading, avoiding, I don't know what we're allowed to say, tax. And I mean, the whole issue with your project about islands, I mean, it seems to me that they're so much now part of the British economy, and in a way which, you know, you might say is very invidious. I don't know whether that's something that he's working on.
Yes, you've raised an absolutely enormous area. I mean, one of the problems with my project is there's too much material, but the one that you're raising is a very important one. It relates to the utopian theme, which I just kind of, you know, brushed over. There are all sorts of projects which take islands and then pronounce separate island status and separate constitutional status. Some of them have been claimed as artistic projects, some of them are claimed as social interventions, have become, again, along with notions of liquid and floating, very, very fashionable. I mean, I hate to boast about my experiences in the contemporary art world, but if anyone went to Frieze, Lucy Orta had this, you could become a member of her, the Antarctic she declared as an open nation state, and you actually got a passport. I considered bringing one along, but we haven't got time. The Tunisian project at the Venice Biennale was also creating a separate state, not this time around an island, but a state that was international, open, utopian in some kind of way. These are all often very crude engagements with ideas of utopianism, but I think you're right that the key point is that you can also have some literal and metaphorical separateness by invoking the island and islandness.
Yeah,
I mean, you can create the sea as your social and physical barrier, and within your, you know, on your island, as with Thomas More, whose utopia was, you know, defined as an island.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose
create this better place, and in hard times, I think fantasies of better places.
But the offshore islands are not utopias. They're not fantasies of better places. They are a testament to the. I mean, what David Harvey has described as the kind of, you know, the flip side of the wonderfully fluxy kind of liquid state of modern capitalism is that actually it allows these kinds of abuses. So there's a. I mean, I wonder how much this is about critique.
Well, every utopia has its dystopia and its negative flip side, and its. I mean, place has its reactionary theories as well, and I think, again, everything seems. You know, the contradictions that are enmeshed in these sorts of projects are absolutely enormous. And, you know, I feel personally, and I'm speaking from the heart now, that what is happening for me anyway, some may disagree with me, in this post-Brexit context in which notions of our separateness have become the key to our national identity seems to me to be moving towards an appallingly reactionary notion of what landscape might be. That's taking it a long way along the line.
Just to follow up, I mean, you know, the offshore capital imagination has islands absolutely at the centre.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, that's
These
right.
are utopias where there's no bad state interference.
Absolutely. But we make lots of money.
So, you know, politically, it can swing a number of ways.
Absolutely. That's every utopia contains its sort of reactionary opposite, or every utopian fantasy, I think.
Are there any other questions? thank all of our speakers this afternoon, and we'll take our break now. Is that right?